please listen very carefully, because there are a bunch of things that apply here. You may want to take some notes with what we talked about. You can videotape, you can audio tape, whatever you want to do, but we're going to go through a bunch of things, because this is a very specific, just fact-based test on this one, but I think it's pretty simple. All right, federal district court, ready, is the lowest level of courts. They only have original jurisdiction, and they have trials. Now, you should know there's more of them. We're not going to test you. They're not going to test you on the number, because when they write the test, there could be courts added. So it's just you should know there's more federal district courts than any other level. All right, then you move to Federal Court of Appeals. They have only appellate jurisdiction. And the big thing that you need to know, and I told you this when we lectured, they make most federal case law. Now that's because they have to hear every appeal from the federal district court. Anybody who has a case in federal district court and goes, I think I was not judged correctly, their case goes to the Federal Court of Appeals, and it has to be heard. Okay, so they actually have to hear the case. So they make more decisions, more actual law than any other federal court. All right? Now, they also hold hearings, okay, which means not like Law and Order where there's a defense and a prosecution and you have witnesses and you do swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
So
none of that occurs. It's just lawyers talking, and you have legal briefs, just like we talked about with the Supreme Court. And in the case of the Federal Court of Appeals, it's usually 3 justices that listen. All right, then going up to the Supreme Court. Now there's some stuff missing here, some good stuff. It's 9 justices currently. Now I know it's 8, but 9 justices normally on the Supreme Court at the current time. Now we know we have 8 in a chair right now because we're waiting for one to be approved. It is the only court with both original and appellate jurisdiction. Now that could be tested. All right. Now some things you don't have on here that you need to know. The number of justices is set by Congress. Okay, that's one of the powers of Congress, is to determine how many justices are on the Supreme Court. All right? And then you should also know that it does not hear most of the cases that are appealed to it. Remember, how many cases are appealed to the Supreme Court each year?
10,000.
10,000. How many do they hear? About 80 to 100. So about 9,000 cases, it says, no, we're not going to hear you. So if you appeal the case to the Supreme Court, most likely the Supreme Court is going to choose not to hear your case, to allow the lower level court decision to stand. That's why most federal case law is made by the Federal Court of Appeals. All right, everybody okay with that? I'm not sure why that's funny, but apparently it is.
No.
I know. All right, any question with that? All right, so then, jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction is the first court to hear a case. Appellate jurisdiction is where you're hearing a case after it has already been decided by another court. Now, it could be second time, third time, fourth time, fifth time. All right, and then concurrent means that you can hear a case at the same time as another court. Okay? Or exclusive jurisdiction means that you are the only court that can hear the case. Now, in the case of a state suing another state, the only place that can go is the U.S. Supreme Court. All right?
I did it.
I'm very proud of you. All right?
Albert,
Now,
we're all proud that you got your mistake out.
Now, this is something that I've already told you is going to be tested. It's been tested before, it's going to be tested again. The federal courts will rarely deal with a case that is a political issue unless it deals with what?
Constitution.
What? Only one thing though, political issue. What's the one issue they'll get involved with? Separation of powers. All right, line item veto, legislative veto are the 2 that come up. The only 2 I've ever seen, but ready, if it's a political issue of anything else, the Supreme Court, the federal courts usually stay out of it. They make the states have to figure it out on their own. Okay, if it's an argument between a governor of a state and a legislature of a state, The federal courts will stay hands-off. If it's between the United States Congress and the president, hands-off, unless it's separation of powers. Okay, and that's one thing that I guarantee you is tested. Okay, it was tested on Clinton versus City of New York with line item veto. Intent is probably going to be tested on this test. All right, cool. All right. Opinions. Majority opinions. It's the one that says this is how we are ruling, and it sets a legal precedent. That idea that has to be followed by the lower courts from this point on. All right, or it sets a rule of law. All right. Then concurring opinions, they agree with the majority, but for a different reason. Remember we talked about Furman versus Georgia, the idea that the death penalty was unconstitutional because it was arbitrary to random because judges were giving the death penalty, compared to that was the majority opinion. The concurring opinion was because it was racially biased. The concurring opinion is not legally binding in any way. It's just the judges want to have their opinion heard. We can listen to it later down the road. Okay? Dissenting opinion are the people who disagree with the majority. Remember we talked about the case before, I'm blanking on it now, the case before Gideon versus Wainwright. The idea of the right to have an attorney. All right, in that case, they said you didn't get an attorney unless you had special circumstances. And that judge, that justice on the Supreme Court said, no, everybody should have it. 20 years later, Gideon versus Wainwright comes out. They look at the dissenting opinion, what he wrote. Okay, so when people write these, they write them in the hopes that someday the Supreme Court will change their opinion, change their decision, and they'll look at those dissenting opinions. Same thing, Plessy versus Ferguson. We have at times, we change what the Supreme Court believes. All right? Cool, cool?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's move. Supreme Court cases. All right. This more, I meant the cases would be under key cases. More here, I wanted to have how a Supreme Court case goes. You should know that people appeal to the Supreme Court. They're called the petitioner. A petitioner will ask the Supreme Court for an appeal. If the Supreme Court then will meet, they get about 200 cases a week. They meet, and the Supreme Court will talk about the cases, usually about 10 to 20 cases. Then they vote. If you get 4 justices to agree, I know you have a rule of 4 somewhere here. Okay, it takes 4 justices to agree to hear a case. Once they agree to hear the case, then they'll issue what's called a writ of certiorari. Okay, the writ of certiorari is a legal document which says we're going to make more certain of that decision. Once they issue that, then they send up the documents from the lower court, and then we start issuing briefs. The plaintiff will send a brief, then the defendant sends a brief, then the plaintiff sends a second brief. Then, the big thing that you need to know, then anybody can send
Amicus.
There are a couple questions on amicus briefs, or amicus briefs. These are friends of the court's briefs, that anybody who has any interest in the case can send in a long document or a short document saying, here's how we think you should rule on this. Okay, now that also leads to, we talked about this also, coalition building. That oftentimes groups will get together and they will send in amicus briefs together to try to build a coalition to show it's not just me that's against this ruling or for this ruling. There are large groups of people, large groups of businesses, large groups of, in our case, we talked about Jerry Falwell and other religious groups fighting against the conviction of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, that we're trying to fight against that idea of taxing or deciding what's a religion and what's a cult based on income. Okay, and groups will get together to say, here's how we think that should be ruled. That's a coalition. Okay? And they do that and they send those amicus briefs to the courts as a group, all right, or as a coalition. All right, does that make sense? Okay, so that's a key term, okay, in courts. So this is a big idea. And it also goes back to interest groups, because oftentimes interest groups will send them. NAACP, NRA, those groups will send amicus briefs. If there's a gun rights issue, NRA is going to send amicus briefs. If there's a civil rights issue, NAACP sending amicus briefs. Remember the NAACP, just going back just as a quick review, remember that the NAACP, one of the big things they did is they were able to use the courts because there wasn't another place for them to go. So they used the courts, and they used the use of amicus briefs to try to influence the courts to help them achieve their goals, because they weren't able to go and use the president, use the Congress, because there weren't enough people that would vote the way they wanted them to, or needed them to. All right, then, once all these briefs have been assigned, then they have hearings. How long are the oral arguments normally? About 30 minutes. Now, it can be longer, but average is 30 minutes. Now, during the 30 minutes, they're going to ask questions. Then they meet after the oral arguments are done. The justices meet on Wednesday and Friday, and they vote. Once they vote, then they'll write out their opinion, and we already talked about the opinion. Cool? I talked too long, I ran out of air. All right, let me breathe. All right, then, selecting justices. You should know the president nominates, Senate approves. You should also know that they serve for life. The president can't fire justices. There are no qualifications. All right, could be a 6-year-old Brazilian boy. All right, good. Oftentimes they're previously prosecutors, state judges. The two things that presidents look for the most: ideology and partisanship. Now, ready? What does Congress look at the most? Why? How? No. What do they look at the most?
Ideology and partisanship.
Right? What's politics about? Ideology and
partisanship.
How many Republicans want to vote for a Democrat? Ready? Only the ones that it helps them get elected. Why is Trump, right now, there are 52 Republicans and 48 Democrats in the Senate. I told you that the new Republican nominee will probably win 60-40. Why? Because there are some people in the Senate up for re-election in 2 years where Trump won. Why will they vote for Trump's nominee? Because Trump won in their state. It's good for them politically to vote for Trump's nominee. If Clinton won in their state, guess how they're voting? They're voting against. They'll vote against that nominee because they're Democrats. Ideology and partisanship. All right, the ideology and partisanship will almost always be the same as the president. Now, once people are in, 25% of judges will end up being not the same ideology and partisanship end for the judge at that point. 25% ideology will change once they become a judge. They'll either be more conservative or more liberal than they were before. All right, any questions with that? Okay, let's move over here. All right, these two, this really is a check. It's not a judicial philosophy. Judicial review is how the judicial branch checks both the executive branch and the legislative branch. It is what gives them power. Now, if you remember, we read in Wilson's book that Wilson argues the only reason we have judges for a long period of time is because we gave them the power of judicial review, and justices went from serving at an average of 7 years to serving at an average of over 20 years. Because you give people power, people like their jobs when they have power. This is their power. Judges get to look at everything the president does, everything Congress does, and determine if it's constitutional or not. That's power. All right, philosophy. Judicial review and judicial activism. All right, judicial restraint. All right, ruling strictly based on what the Constitution says. Okay? Using the words of the Constitution, the words of the law, and ready, one other thing that you want to remember, they also allow the politicians to make the laws. They don't want to interfere with what it means. Okay, so if a law says we're going to allow people to use, like we talked about the gender law now, the LBGT law. If we allow you, if we say you have to go to the bathroom of whatever you're biologically said on your birth certificate, a judicial restraint will look at it and go, you got a bathroom to use. That's okay. That's not discriminatory, because you have a bathroom that will be legitimately yours, and it's okay because we don't have to read into the law at all. It's up to the politicians, it's up to the citizens to vote out that politician if it's unequal somehow. Okay, that's judicial restraint. You just look at the words of the law, no meaning. Okay, everybody's got an equal bathroom. They both have toilets. I know, men, you have urinals. All right? Woo. All right? Judicial activism now, you're going to apply the Constitution, the meaning of the Constitution, to modern ages. Okay, the best one, Griswold versus Connecticut, you take the first, the third, the fourth, and the ninth, and you create a right to privacy. You go, they must have wanted a right to privacy because they gave you freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. They said they can't put soldiers in your home. They told you we can't search your house without a search warrant. And they said Ninth Amendment says that you have rights that aren't written here. So all that taken together, I ran out of time, sorry. I heard the bell. All those taken together must mean that you have a right to privacy. Okay? And they look at laws and they say, the LGTB law is discriminatory because it's really meant for one group of people. I don't care if you each have a bathroom. Okay? That's judicial activism. All right? All right. And then this is kind of judicial activism too. They reinterpret the Constitution. They become independent policymakers. Now, part of the problem with judicial activism, how far can you go? All right? Key cases, this one, and this one. Now, we haven't got really to Miranda yet. We will when we get to individual rights. Marbury versus Madison, you need to know judicial review. That's going to be the case in this case because judicial review is the power of the courts to, well, it's the power of the courts. The power of the courts to do any checks and balances. McCulloch versus Maryland, supremacy clause and implied powers. Gibbons versus Ogden is the idea of commerce clause. This is the one that I can guarantee is going to be tested, I believe. All right? Writ of certiorari we already talked about. Stare decisis and precedent. The idea, stare decisis is kind of the legal term. The idea that we're going to look at what's been decided before and we're going to go with that. Most of the time, the great percentage of time, justices look at what's been decided before and we allow that to stand. Legal precedent is the same idea, except once a judge decides something, every court below it has to go with that. Okay, and then it becomes stare decisis. Okay, 20 years from now, whatever's decided today will be stare decisis. All right, we talked about. Plaintiff, defendant, I think we know. Won't be on the test. Precedent. I already got coalition building, which was on my list. All right. Checks on the judiciary. All right. Ones you need to know. Oh, Senate set. There should be Congress sets a number of justices. All right. Rewrites legislation. Can propose amendments. Good. President interprets cases. Good. President appoints judges. Senate approves. The one you missed on here is impeachment. Remember that the Congress can impeach judges. Now remember, it's Congress, because House would impeach, Senate would judge. All right? Any questions on anything I just went over really fast? All right, there are 4 review questions. Ready? One has to do with appointments that do not need to be confirmed by the Senate. One deals with vetoes. Could be line item, could be pocket, could just be regular vetoes. One deals with standing committees. One of those special standing committees you need to know about. and one deals with the differences between the House and the Senate. All right, coming to this review, you got extra credit points, and you got to know the 4 review questions. All right, if you have any more questions, I'll answer it. As soon as I'm done erasing, if you want to come back to the room for another 37 minutes, I will stay for 37 minutes if you want to work on correctives or ask more questions or, I don't know, do yoga, whatever.
Are you going to tell us the topics for the